Well, here you go, proof positive that there was a psych unit or mental health clinic here behind the Clark Air Base Hospital.
I turned to Vietnam War expert Dr. Andrew Wiest for some insight into the need for a psychiatric ward.
I can only presume that the psychic injuries that wound up at Clark were worse than the ones the guys had to deal with in Vietnam. So the facilities...
Dr. Wiest explained that Clark had been a hospital for some of the worst casualties of the war in Vietnam. Those who suffered both physically and psychologically.
So what's the difference between Vietnam syndrome and PTSD?
Vietnam syndrome and PTSD are actually the same thing. It's essentially soldiers seeing so much trauma in combat that they come home changed. Vietnam syndrome was the same thing that soldiers have been seeing ever since war began. War destroys young men's souls. And in this case, what in World War I had been called shell shock, in World War II it was called combat exhaustion. After Vietnam was called Vietnam syndrome, and what's later called post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD isn't simple. PTSD involves everything from flashbacks to nightmares to being unable to function in society.
So if PTSD hadn't been diagnosed yet, how did the doctors treat it?
Their job was to stick a Band-Aid on these soldiers' minds and send them back to battle as often as they could. So did they deal with PTSD? Did they attempt to cure it? They couldn't have.
So the ghost stories from the security guards, do you think those are inspired by terrible things that happened here?
These are places of immense trauma, of immense psychic suffering. And I have no doubt that these places would have remnants of that psychic suffering to this day. But very few veterans would have gone back to Clark. They probably want to go to where it happened, as opposed to where it was dealt with the first time, if that makes sense. So like if you're wounded in the Hurricane Katrina down here, you probably want to go to New Orleans, not go to the hospital you were treated in.
It was clear Vietnam was horrific for the soldiers that fought there. PTSD was as yet an undiagnosed condition that continues to the present day, haunting modern soldiers in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. The war, the death, the killing haunts them long after they've left the battlefield.
While several elements of the Marine assault team were